In the far north of Saskatchewan, the town of Buffalo Narrows sits surrounded by dense boreal forests and frozen lakes, a place where life moves slowly and everyone knows their neighbors. In the late 1960s, the population was just over 700, making it a tight-knit community. The Peterson family was well known in town. Thomas Peterson and his wife Bernadette were in their early 30s, raising a family of 7 children. Their modest 2-room home was a hub of daily life, with children playing in the snow outside in winter and helping with household chores during the warmer months. The Pedersons were respected for their faith and their commitment to the community. They were Roman Catholic and participated actively in local events and church services. Life in Buffalo Narrows was shaped by the harsh northern winters, with temperatures regularly dropping well below freezing. Residents relied on one main road that could often be blocked by snow, making the town feel isolated from the rest of Saskatchewan. On the night of January 30th, 1969, the town was blanketed in deep winter darkness. Most families were asleep early, and snow muffled the usual sounds of the small settlement. The Pedersen children had a rare break from their normal routine. 2 of the older girls, Connie and Cynthia, were staying at their grandmother's house for a sleepover. This small detail would later prove critical. Inside the Peterson home, the family's youngest children were tucked into their beds. The house was quiet, lit only by a small kerosene lamp in the kitchen, and the wind whispered outside through the cracks in the windows. In this peaceful setting, the foundations of the family's safe, ordinary life were about to be shattered by events that would shock the entire community. In the dead of night, on January 30th, 1969, 19-year-old Frederick Moses McCallum left his small home in Buffalo Narrows. He had been living on the edge of town, doing day labor and struggling with serious mental health issues that were known to some in the community. That evening, McCallum carried a long-handled fire axe and moved deliberately through the snow-covered streets toward the Peterson house. The night was bitterly cold, with temperatures reaching around 40 degrees below zero, and a strong wind carried the sound of footsteps across the frozen land. Inside the Peterson home, the youngest children were asleep, unaware of the danger approaching. McCallum entered the house and attacked with a chilling precision. Thomas and Bernadette Pedersen were killed, along with a family friend who was staying overnight, Jean-Baptiste Herman, aged 48. In the second bedroom, 5 of the Peterson children were found injured. The small figure of 7-year-old Fred Donald Pedersen would later be discovered alive, having survived despite serious injuries. When the Royal Canadian Mounted Police arrived later that morning, they were met with a scene that stunned even seasoned officers. Snow crunched underfoot as they approached the home, and the cold air seemed to amplify the silence of the settlement. It was immediately clear that the attack had been confined to the house. Nothing in the surrounding area had been disturbed. The RCMP set up an immediate perimeter and began gathering information from neighbors and townspeople, while ensuring the surviving child received medical attention. The investigation at that moment was both delicate and urgent. Officers knew that in a town as small as Buffalo Narrows, the killer could not have gone far. They interviewed neighbors, reviewed recent conflicts in the community, and began piecing together the movements of McCallum. Witnesses reported seeing him leave his home that night carrying something long and heavy, moving with a deliberate, almost trance-like focus. As the morning sun struggled to rise over the frozen trees and lakes, the RCMP began planning a manhunt. Roadblocks were set up on the few roads that connected the town to the outside world. Aircraft were readied to survey the surrounding forests, while officers on foot moved through the snow in coordinated search parties. The small northern community of Buffalo Narrows watched with fear and disbelief, realizing that a tragedy of unimaginable proportions had occurred in their midst. This initial discovery and rapid police response set the stage for understanding both the killer and the shocking motives behind the attack. The residents of Buffalo Narrows were left grappling with the horrifying reality that someone from their own town could commit such an act, while the authorities faced the urgent task of preventing further violence. Frederick Moses McCallum was 19 years old at the time of the attack, but his life had already been marked by instability and hardship. He grew up in a fragmented household as one of 9 half-siblings, each with different fathers, and experienced frequent moves between foster homes. By the age of 16, he had already spent time in youth detention for minor offenses. It was during these early years that those around him began to notice serious mental health issues. McCallum reported hearing voices and believed that everyday objects, like radios, were communicating directly with him. After the murders, McCallum did not flee. Instead, he calmly returned to his mother's home, where he made a phone call to the local priest. In that call, he confessed to the attack and provided details only the perpetrator could know. The priest immediately contacted the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, who arrived quickly in the small northern town. McCallum was found sitting at the kitchen table drinking tea, appearing unusually calm, given the magnitude of his actions. He reportedly expressed no remorse, and some of his statements indicated a disturbing detachment from reality. The RCMP immediately took him into custody without any resistance. They secured the scene at his residence and began a detailed interview process. Investigators noted that McCallum's mental state was fragile, and he described his actions in ways that reflected disordered thinking. Psychiatric professionals were called in to evaluate him, and it was during this assessment that he was formally diagnosed with schizophrenia. This diagnosis explained his distorted perceptions, hallucinations, and inability to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. Police also reviewed McCallum's past interactions with the justice and welfare systems. Records confirmed that despite repeated signs of mental illness, he had received minimal long-term support. While in foster care, he had experienced inconsistent supervision, which may have contributed to the escalation of his condition. Officers considered these factors while preparing the case, knowing that his mental state would play a central role in the legal proceedings to follow. The residents of Buffalo Narrows were both relieved and unsettled by the quick arrest. While the immediate threat had ended, the town now faced the challenge of understanding how such a tragedy could occur in their close-knit community. Families were left grappling with grief, and local authorities began planning counseling and support for survivors. The arrest marked the end of the immediate search, but it also signaled the beginning of a complex legal and psychiatric examination that would dominate headlines in Saskatchewan for months to come. McCallum's behavior after the arrest raised further questions about his awareness of reality. He described feeling as if he were in a trance during the attack, stating that he looked at himself in the mirror and questioned if it was really him committing the acts. These chilling reflections underscored the challenges faced by the justice system in determining culpability when mental illness was a key factor. The arrest and subsequent psychiatric evaluation would form the foundation for a case that captured national attention. Experts debated whether McCallum could be held responsible for his actions, and the town of Buffalo Narrows braced for the trial that would follow, a trial that promised to test the limits of both the law and public understanding of mental illness in criminal cases. Frederick McCallum's trial began in the fall of 1969 and quickly became one of the most closely watched legal proceedings in northern Saskatchewan. The prosecution focused on the deaths of Thomas Pedersen and Jean-Baptiste Herman, although all 7 victims were discussed in court. From the beginning, the defense argued that McCallum was suffering from schizophrenia, a severe mental disorder that left him unable to understand the consequences of his actions. Psychiatric experts explained in detail how he experienced hallucinations, disordered thinking, and a profound disconnection from reality, which directly influenced the tragic events of January the 30th. The jury, composed entirely of men from outside the local Indigenous community, faced the difficult task of balancing the severity of the crimes with the evidence of McCallum's mental illness. During the proceedings, the defense presented accounts of his unstable upbringing, including years spent in foster care, early brushes with the law, and repeated signs of mental health struggles. Witnesses described his erratic behavior in the months leading up to the attack, highlighting how he had isolated himself and displayed unusual preoccupations with their voices and visions. After deliberating for 4.5 hours, the jury delivered a verdict of not guilty by reason of insanity. In Canada, at the time, this legal designation meant that while McCallum had committed the acts, he could not be held criminally responsible due to his inability to distinguish right from wrong at the time of the crime. The verdict was met with shock and confusion from the surviving family members and the wider community. Many struggled to reconcile the fact that the man who had destroyed so many lives would not spend time in prison, but instead be placed in a psychiatric institution. Following the verdict, McCallum was sent to a secure psychiatric facility for treatment. Over the following years, he would experience transfers between institutions, including brief stays in maximum security facilities, but his diagnosis of schizophrenia remained the central factor guiding his care. Meanwhile, the surviving Peterson children faced ongoing challenges. The two sisters, Connie and Cynthia, were left without their parents and younger siblings, while Fred, who had survived the attack, had to cope with long-term injuries and trauma. The community of Buffalo Narrows rallied to support the survivors, but the psychological scars remained, shaping the lives of the family and neighbors for decades. The case also sparked broader discussions about mental health, the justice system, and how society treats individuals with severe psychiatric disorders. Many observers argued that McCallum's upbringing and lack of early intervention contributed to the tragic outcome. Others focused on the need for better support systems in remote communities, where access to mental health care was limited. The trial highlighted gaps in the legal system when dealing with defendants whose crimes were intertwined with profound mental illness. Decades later, the Buffalo Narrows murders continue to be remembered as a defining event in the town's history. The case remains a cautionary example of how untreated mental illness, combined with social and institutional failures, can result in devastating consequences. Survivors and their descendants carry the memory of that night, often sharing their stories to raise awareness about mental health and the importance of early intervention. Though more than 50 years have passed since January 30th, 1969, the murders left an indelible mark on Saskatchewan. The tragedy shaped local policies, influenced psychiatric practices, and left a community grappling with the long-term effects of violence that could have been prevented. For the Peterson family, the memory of that night is a reminder of both unimaginable loss and the resilience of those who survived to tell the story. Wilbert Colin Thatcher was born in the year 1938 in Saskatchewan, a province where politics and farming shaped much of daily life. He was the son of Ross Thatcher, a man who would go on to serve as premier of the province from 1964 until his death in 1971. Growing up in this household, Colin Thatcher was surrounded by influence and privilege. He learned early on how much power and reputation mattered in public life, and he appeared destined to follow in his father's footsteps. Colin Thatcher was educated both in Canada and in the United States. He attended schools in Saskatchewan before studying at the University of Saskatchewan and later at the University of Wisconsin. These years gave him experience outside of his home province, but they also tied him closely to the image of a young man being groomed for leadership. In addition to politics, Thatcher developed a strong interest in ranching, and by the late 1960s, he managed large stretches of land near Moose Jaw. His success in agriculture boosted his standing, showing he was not only the son of a premier, but also a businessman in his own right. In the year 1962, Thatcher married Joanne Geiger. The two of them seemed to represent stability and prosperity, raising their 3 children in a world that blended wealth, politics, and rural traditions. For much of the 1960s, they lived the kind of life admired in Saskatchewan's close-knit communities. Publicly, Colin Thatcher worked to shape his image as a devoted family man and serious rancher. Privately, his drive for control and influence was already a central part of his personality. By the early 1970s, Colin Thatcher stepped formally into politics. In 1975, he was elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly for the Progressive Conservative Party. He quickly gained attention for being outspoken, ambitious, and confident, earning a reputation as a politician who was not afraid of confrontation. In 1982, when Grant Devine became premier, Thatcher was appointed as Minister of Energy and Mines. This placed him at the heart of one of the most important portfolios in Saskatchewan, where debates about resources and energy shaped much of the province's economy. During this time, Thatcher was seen by some as a rising star, and a man who had the name, the connections, and the experience to one day reach the top of Saskatchewan politics. But the pressure of public office, combined with the strain in his personal life, would soon set the stage for conflict. The same determination and defiance that served him in politics began to appear in his marriage and family relationships. Beneath the polished image of a powerful politician, tensions were building that would eventually spill out into one of the most infamous criminal cases in Canadian history. By the late 1970s, the marriage between Colin Thatcher and his wife Joanne had begun to unravel. What had once seemed like a picture of stability was breaking apart under constant arguments and growing mistrust. Thatcher's political career was advancing, but life at home was marked by distance and hostility. Joanne, who had once been supportive of her husband's ambitions, grew increasingly unhappy in the marriage. Their differences, once private, soon spilled into the open and became part of a bitter separation. In 1981, Joanne and Colin Thatcher formally divorced, ending nearly 2 decades of marriage. But the separation did not bring peace. Instead, it marked the beginning of a long and heated battle over money, property, and custody of their 3 children. Thatcher insisted on control, while Joanne pushed back, determined to secure independence for herself and her children. The legal fights between them became increasingly drawn out and filled with anger. The divorce coincided with Thatcher's growing influence in provincial politics, making the conflict a public matter as well as a private one. Joanne often felt intimidated and pressured, telling friends and family that she believed her former husband was determined to make her life as difficult as possible. The stress of their dispute began to affect Joanne's health and emotional well-being. Despite this, she refused to back down, continuing to pursue her rights in court. In the early 1980s, Joanne moved into a home in Regina, where she focused on raising her children and rebuilding her life. She tried to create stability in the face of constant legal and personal battles. Friends later recalled her as resilient, though deeply worn down by the ongoing struggles with her ex-husband, while Colin Thatcher projected the image of a successful rancher and politician. His feud with Joanne became an increasingly consuming part of his private life. As the years passed, the hostility between them only deepened. Disputes over financial support, property, and access to their children kept the two locked in conflict. Joanne often expressed fear and exhaustion, feeling as though she could never escape her ex-husband's reach. The bitterness of their divorce went beyond what many expected, raising concerns among those closest to Joanne that the situation could spiral further. This growing sense of unease would soon take a tragic turn, leaving Saskatchewan stunned. On the night of January 21st, 1983, Joanne Wilson was found dead in her Regina home. The scene left investigators immediately suspecting foul play. The violent nature of the crime stunned the community, not only because of its brutality, but also because Joanne was known as a kind and devoted mother who had been fighting to create stability after her divorce. Her death quickly became one of the most high-profile cases in Saskatchewan. Police launched an extensive investigation, combing through Joanne's personal life, her ongoing legal disputes, and her strained relationship with her ex-husband, Colin Thatcher. Almost immediately, questions arose about whether the hostility between the two had crossed into something darker. While Thatcher was a well-known political figure and had cultivated an image of authority and influence, the bitter divorce and lengthy custody battles placed him in the spotlight as a possible suspect. Detectives examined Joanne's home for evidence, collected witness statements, and followed leads that suggested her death may not have been a random act. Friends of Joanne told investigators that she had been fearful in the months leading up to her murder. Her concerns about safety became critical pieces in building a timeline of events that helped police narrow their focus. In the weeks following the crime, public interest only grew stronger. Newspapers across Saskatchewan carried daily updates, and radio stations discussed the shocking case, often connecting it back to Thatcher's political prominence. The murder was not just a personal tragedy, but now a public scandal that mixed politics, crime, and deep community concern. By mid-1983, investigators were convinced that Joanne's murder was a targeted attack rather than a random incident. They worked to gather enough evidence to support their suspicions, slowly building a case that pointed towards someone connected to Thatcher. Behind closed doors, whispers spread about the possibility of a murder-for-hire plot, something that would have seemed unimaginable only a few years earlier. The investigation set the stage for one of Saskatchewan's most sensational trials, where private family struggles would collide with public politics, and the question of Colin Thatcher's guilt would dominate headlines across the country. By May of 1984, after months of investigation, police formally charged Colin Thatcher with first-degree murder in connection with the death of his ex-wife, Joanne Wilson. His arrest shocked Saskatchewan, not only because of the crime itself, but because Thatcher had been a highly visible politician, once serving as Minister of Energy and Resources. The charges ensured that the case would become one of the most closely watched trials in Canadian history. The trial began in Saskatoon in the autumn of 1984. Courtrooms were filled daily with reporters, members of the public, and legal experts who wanted to witness the downfall of a man who had once belonged to one of the province's most prominent families. The prosecution presented a detailed case built on both circumstantial evidence and witness testimony, including accounts from individuals who claimed Thatcher had spoken openly about harming his ex-wife. Though the murder weapon was never recovered, prosecutors tied Thatcher to firearms purchases, suspicious activity near Joanne's home, and testimony that painted him as controlling and vengeful. Thatcher's defense team tried to dismantle the Crown's evidence, arguing that the case against him was built on speculation. In a dramatic move, Thatcher himself chose to testify. While he remained calm at times, moments of anger and arrogance on the stand weakened his credibility with the jury. The prosecution emphasized that Joanne's murder was not random, but instead the culmination of years of hostility, legal battles, and threats. On November the 6th, 1984, the jury delivered its verdict. Colin Thatcher was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years. The conviction marked a stunning fall from grace for a man born into political privilege, and it permanently linked his name to one of Canada's most infamous domestic homicide cases. Thatcher launched several appeals in the years that followed, all of which were rejected by higher courts. While serving his sentence, he wrote a book in which he claimed he had been wrongfully convicted. In response, Saskatchewan passed legislation to prevent convicted criminals from profiting off their crimes, directing royalties from his book toward victims' groups. After serving 22 years, Thatcher was granted full parole in November of 2006. He returned to private life, eventually remarrying and continuing to maintain his innocence. However, his legacy remained tarnished. In 2022, his attendance at a legislative ceremony caused public outrage, reigniting debate about whether he should ever have been welcomed back into the political arena. Today, the name Colin Thatcher is remembered less for his time as a cabinet minister and more for the crime that shocked a province. His conviction underscored how even those with power and influence are not immune to justice. For many Canadians, the case remains a chilling reminder of betrayal, abuse of privilege, and how a political dynasty collapsed under the weight of murder. In the rolling field north of Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, life moved slowly and predictably in the summer of 1967. The Peterson family lived on a modest farm just outside the small community of Shell Lake, surrounded by miles of wheat fields and dense patches of forest. James Peterson, a 47-year-old war veteran, and his 42-year-old wife, Evelyn, raised their family with a strong sense of routine and community. Their home was simple but warm, filled with laughter, chores, and the constant hum of daily farm life. The Petersons had 9 children, ranging in age from 1 to 19 years old, with 4-year-old Phyllis being among the youngest. The eldest, 19-year-old Kathy, had recently married and moved to British Columbia, leaving the rest of the children at home. The family was well known and respected in the community, often helping neighbors during harvests and sharing in local gatherings. There were no known disputes, deaths, or conflicts. The Petersons were seen as a model family in rural Saskatchewan, living a quiet life of hard work and family bonds. Neighbors described the farm as cheerful and lively. Mornings were marked by early chores, tending to animals, and preparing meals for the children before school. Evenings were spent around the dinner table, and weekends often included visits from friends or nearby relatives. It was the kind of life where everyone knew one another, and doors were left unlocked, trusting in the safety of the small town and its surrounding farmland. Yet, beneath the peaceful surface of Shell Lake, a storm was quietly forming. Far away in the nearby town of Lesk, 21-year-old Victor Ernest Hoffman was battling a rapidly deteriorating mental state. He had been released from a mental hospital only weeks earlier, carrying with him delusions and hallucinations that were growing stronger each day. At that moment, the serene rhythm of farm life in Shell Lake would soon collide with the uncontrollable force of Hoffman's troubled mind, setting the stage for one of Canada's most unimaginable tragedies. Despite the calm, sunny days and familiar routines, the Peterson family's story was about to be marked forever by a single, catastrophic night that would leave a lasting scar on the community and the prairies around Shell Lake. The farm, once a symbol of stability and care, would become the site of a crime that shocked an entire province and remains a chilling example of the consequences of untreated mental illness. In the early hours of August 15th, 1967, the prairie sky over Shell Lake was dark and quiet, the kind of stillness that stretches across miles of wheat fields and dirt roads. Victor Ernest Hoffman, age 21, left his parents' home in Lesk, driving along the empty country roads. He was carrying a .22 caliber Browning pump-action rifle, and his mind was consumed by the voices and hallucinations that had been tormenting him for years. Hoffman had been discharged from the Saskatchewan hospital only 3 weeks earlier, and the mental health treatment he received had not resolved his delusions. The farmhouse of the Peterson family came into view under the dim glow of the pre-dawn light. Hoffman had never visited the farm before and had no personal connection to the family. According to statements he later made to police, he believed he was following instructions from voices in his head, directing him toward the house. The tranquility of the rural neighborhood contrasted sharply with the dark intentions driving him that night. He entered the small white farmhouse, moving methodically through the 4-room home. The children were asleep, and the parents were still awake in the main living area. The household was completely unaware of the danger approaching, and no alarm was raised. In a matter of minutes, Hoffman carried out his plan, resulting in the deaths of 9 members of the Peterson family. Amid this devastating act, one life was spared. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson survived the night, hidden under bedclothes and shielded by the presence of her siblings. She later recalled being frightened by the unfamiliar voices and by the arrival of many police officers, but physically, she was unharmed. Her survival would later be a crucial part of the story, providing investigators with insight into the sequence of events and preserving a connection to the family for the community to remember. The night ended with a silence that seemed heavier than the still prairie air. The calm that had characterized life on the farm was broken forever, and Shell Lake would never feel the same. The tragedy marked the beginning of a complex investigation and a wider discussion in Canada about mental health, responsibility, and community safety in the face of unforeseen violence. Later that morning, on August 15th, 1967, a neighbor named Wildrew Lang approached the Peterson farmhouse. He had planned to help with the day's chores, but the house was eerily quiet. Upon entering, he realized something was seriously wrong. The scene inside shocked him, and he immediately drove 4 miles to the nearest telephone to alert authorities. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police quickly arrived and secured the area, beginning a careful examination of the house. They confirmed the deaths of 9 family members, but also discovered a small miracle. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson was found unharmed, tucked beneath bedclothes, and protected by her siblings. Officers who carried her from the home noted the quiet resilience of the young girl amidst the tragedy surrounding her. The discovery of the crime set off one of the largest manhunts in Saskatchewan's history. Officers established roadblocks on rural highways and coordinated search parties to cover miles of farmland, forests, and small roads. Information came in from locals in other provinces as authorities worked tirelessly to identify and locate the perpetrator. Tips eventually pointed to a young man in Lesk who had recently been released from a mental hospital. Authorities focused on Victor Hoffman, and within 4 days, on August 19th, 1967, he was located and arrested at his parents' home. He surrendered without resistance, ending the manhunt, but opening a new chapter in understanding the motives and mental state behind the unimaginable crime. Victor Ernest Hoffman, born in 1946, had a long history of mental health struggles that had largely gone unnoticed. From a young age, he experienced hallucinations and disturbing thoughts, which became more intense as he grew older. By his teenage years, Hoffman had developed paranoid delusions that worried his family, but were not fully understood by the medical professionals overseeing his care. In July 1967, just weeks before the murders, Hoffman had been admitted to the Saskatchewan hospital for treatment. He received medication and other therapies. Yet the severity of his condition was underestimated. He was released under the care of his parents, who tried to manage his increasingly erratic behavior at home. Despite warning signs, no one anticipated that Hoffman would commit one of the most shocking crimes in Canadian history. Upon his arrest, police and psychiatrists quickly realized the depth of his mental illness. Hoffman described hearing voices and seeing visions that commanded his actions. His diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia was confirmed, and it became clear that he was not only severely unwell, but also disconnected from reality in ways that made him extremely dangerous. Hoffman's statements after his arrest were often contradictory. He spoke of being influenced by dark forces, but also showed moments of lucidity when recalling the events leading up to the murders. These details helped authorities understand his mindset and provided crucial context for the trial that would follow. The case highlighted the serious gaps in mental health care and the challenges of identifying individuals at risk of committing severe acts of violence before tragedy strikes. The aftermath of the Shell Lake murders left an enduring mark on the community and the province of Saskatchewan. In February 1968, Victor Hoffman was found not guilty by reason of insanity and committed to a secure psychiatric institution where he would spend the remainder of his life. This verdict sparked national discussion about mental health care, the responsibility of institutions, and the challenges of preventing such tragedies. For the surviving family members, life was forever changed. 4-year-old Phyllis Peterson was raised under the care of her older sister Kathy and her husband, who returned from British Columbia to support the family. Phyllis grew up carrying the weight of the trauma, often struggling with nightmares and the attention brought by being the sole survivor. The community of Shell Lake rallied around the Petersons, offering support while also processing their own grief over the devastating event. The case also influenced mental health policy in Canada, highlighting the risks of discharging patients without adequate follow-up or support. Hoffman's story became a cautionary tale about the importance of early intervention and careful monitoring of individuals with severe psychiatric disorders. Today, the Shell Lake murders remain one of Canada's most infamous cases of random mass violence. The Peterson family is remembered for their close bonds and resilience, and the events of August 15th, 1967, serve as a haunting reminder of how fragile safety can be in even the most peaceful communities. The story continues to resonate, emphasizing the critical need for awareness, compassion, and vigilance in both mental health care and community support systems.